Hey, welcome to the next video in our setting up shop series, looking at all the tools in the workshop and the workbenches and all that stuff. Today we're going to move into saws. And just like with the planes, we're going to move from coarse to fine. So for cabinet working, joiners work, smaller furniture scale stuff, the coarsest saw that you're going to be using is your ripsaw, your big handsaw ripsaw. Now these can range in teeth per inch in coarseness or fineness, but some of the coarsest ones that are around that I've seen are 4 teeth per inch. 4 teeth per inch, that's pretty coarse, and I love it. I used to have a finer, maybe something closer to like a 6 teeth per inch, which maybe sounds coarse to you, but that's nothing. Because this job, the tool for this work needs to be coarse because the job requires fast work. It requires ripping. You're just trying to make big boards, narrower, so you can get your 4-inch rails or whatever. So this job is not a finishing tool, so we don't want to worry about fineness. We want to worry about speed. We want to be thinking about how fast can we make this rough tool do its work. So what I want to do is look at 2 different ways to do this, because I found people, talk about ripping as just terrible. Why would you want to rip by hand? Maybe I'll cut dovetails by hand. Maybe I'll chop a mortise, maybe, if I feel crazy. But no way on earth would I want to rip a board with a handsaw. That sounds terrible. We have table saws for that. But I don't buy it anymore. I used to think that way. But over the past few years especially, I've been just, my confidence in that kind of assertion is eroding. Sure, if you're trying to run a factory and make a bunch of stuff, sure, you need some big machinery. But if you're just one person trying to make furniture, you don't need that kind of stuff. You need a proper tool, properly sharpened, and proper techniques, and you'll find out that, oh wow, actually this whole idea of hand tools as being inefficient, it's just a myth. It's just made up. So I want to look at a few of those things today, show you kind of how I would approach it in 2 different ways, and then hopefully I'll encourage you to give it a shot to get rid of your 6 TPI ripsaw if you have one, and go get yourself a 4 TPI ripsaw, something that's nice and coarse. So let's look at these 2 ways to do ripping. Okay, so the first way is with this saw bench here. This Roman style bench, a lot of people are calling it now, but it's just a super long saw bench. And it's ripping the board in a horizontal position. It's quite common to see this. And I find especially for longer stock, that's maybe 6 feet, that's really the way you want to do it. But even for shorter stuff like this, it can work great. So you have your knee down on one to clamp it. You don't want to mess with clamps trying to clamp a board down for this, because you have your body to be able to do that. So I have a line scribed, and the biggest thing with these saws is just like any other kind of sawing, but the biggest thing I found is people have a hard time starting this cut because the teeth are so coarse. When you have the teeth starting there, it's quite aggressive, right? It's really taking a big bite. But it's not a big deal. It's not something that takes too much time to learn to do. I have my thumb on the side of the saw, holding the saw plate where I need it to guide it. I set it just outside of my line. You want to be with this saw outside of your line. Don't cut it close. Don't try to split the line. Don't try to stay right on it. You want to be able to allow some material on the outside of the line, maybe a 1/16, so that you can plane it away. So I'll set my saw outside of the line. You can pull back, or I'll do little tiny bites just to get going, because you're outside of it. So there's some flexibility here. But once you get a kerf and you know where you're going to be, then you can take big cuts. So this is ripping. Now this is only 3/4 inch pine, but I've found that if I have 1 inch pine with this saw, every stroke is 1 inch of progression. 1 inch thick pine, 1 inch of progression per 1 stroke. So this should be a little bit better than that, but we'll see. Okay. So I can just flip it over and saw from the other side. Do the same. You'll see as I'm going, I'm blowing the sawdust away. Because even though it's cutting on the push and pushing most of the sawdust to the floor, it's still pulling up a bunch of stuff. This is an aggressive operation. So I'm just making contact at the top, but I still have at the very bottom a little bit hanging out. You can see all these fibers hanging from the ripsaw. So I'll just do a gentle final few strokes. And there we go. So that's that. That's not that big of a deal. It's pine. Obviously, the harder the wood, the more work it is, the slower it goes. But this is an aerobic thing. This isn't a muscle thing. So if you're not ripped, like me, I'm not ripped, I just find this to be an aerobic thing, and you let the tool do the work. But let me show you the second way that you can do ripping. The second method is at the bench. So this is for shorter boards. Obviously, if I had 6 foot long board, that's not going to work. But for shorter stock, this works great. So what I'll do is, you still want to saw from both sides. So I clamp it in about halfway, so I know I can, when I flip it over, I'm still going to be able to finish my cut. And it's basically the same thing. I find that because it's clamped right in the middle, it's in the vise right in the middle, it still can flex a little bit, so I'll push against the board to kind of stabilize it as it gets started. And you can see how hard that is to start. It wants to get going there. Okay, so now it's the same thing, but you'll see that my saw is not usually so angled. It's not quite as angled as when I'm sawing horizontally. I'm typically more parallel to the floor, the teeth. I gotta watch it. I gotta be careful when I'm steering. I can angle it. Sometimes I'll drop down to one knee if I need to make sure that I'm staying straight. But if you can saw, you can rip with your teeth parallel to the floor. You just got to be careful you don't all of a sudden steer off course, because that can happen. So let's watch this. This rip. Don't cut your bench in half. Right? There we go. So it's not that big of a deal. Obviously this is pine. Maple is going to be more work. Oak will be work. But it is a totally doable operation. And so that's it. That's pretty much the idea of the ripsaw. It doesn't do a whole lot, but what it does awesome. So I hope that's an encouragement to you that you should be picking up this saw. It's an essential tool in your kit. You could rip with a crosscut saw, but I would not recommend it. You will, perpetuate the myth that ripping is really too hard to do or not realistic. So get yourself a ripsaw, get set up, and go to work.